Good evening and welcome back. The hour has grown still, and the room around you has begun the slow practice of letting go of the day. The lamps are low, the corners have softened. Whatever the morning brought, whatever the afternoon asked, whatever the evening still holds in its small busy hands, you may begin now, little by little, to set it down. There is no urgency here. The story we are about to enter is older than urgency. It has waited a long time already. It will wait, patient as a stone at the foot of a long slope, for as much of your attention as you can give before sleep takes you. Let your shoulders settle. Let your jaw rest. Let your hands lie wherever they have come to rest, open or folded, whichever feels more natural to the body that has carried you this far. There is no pose to maintain tonight. There is no question to answer before the morning. The day, with all its rough edges, may now begin its slow folding away into memory, and the night, kind and old, may begin to gather you up. Tonight, we enter the story of Sisyphus, the king of Corinth, the most cunning of mortal men, the one who tricked death twice and who was finally given a punishment in the Underworld that has become one of the most famous images in all the old mythology. He is the figure rolling the boulder up the long slope, the figure for whom the boulder rolls back down just as he reaches the summit, the figure who must begin again and again and again. His story is harder than many of the other stories in this series. It does not have the silver moonlight of Artemis or the bright clarity of Apollo. It has, instead, a kind of strange wisdom about effort, about repetition, about the long human work that does not always seem to lead anywhere, and about the small dignity that nevertheless remains in such work. We will move through these images slowly. We will not press them. We will let them rise and fade like figures painted faintly on the wall of an old underworld cavern. Get cozy, settle in, and let us begin. You may close your eyes if your eyes wish to close. The story will keep its shape without you watching it. The Greeks who first told it would have understood. They told their stories often around fires in the dark hours when the work of the day had ended and the bodies of the listeners had begun their own quiet slumber. The teller continued. The listener slept or did not sleep, as the listener wished. The story carried on regardless, and it kept its dignity because the teller knew that dignity does not require an audience that is always awake. In the beginning of this telling, we must step back into the very early days of Greek myth, before the cities of historical Greece had taken their full shape, when the Peloponnese was still being settled and the lineages of its kings were still being established. Sisyphus was, in the old tradition, the son of Aeolus, the king of Thessaly, who was a son of Helen, who was a son of Deucalion, the man who survived the Great Flood with his wife Pyrrha, and who became the ancestor of the Greek peoples. So Sisyphus was, in the family tree of the old mythology, one of the very earliest mortal kings, descended from the survivors of the deluge, born into the small new world that had emerged after the waters had withdrawn. He was sent as a young man to found a city on the Isthmus of Corinth, that narrow strip of land that connects the Peloponnese to mainland Greece. The position was a fortunate one. The Isthmus controlled the traffic between two seas, the Saronic Gulf to the east and the Corinthian Gulf to the west. Whoever held the Isthmus held a kind of natural toll gate on the trade of the ancient Mediterranean. Sisyphus, who was already known among the Greeks as the most clever of mortals, recognized the value of the place at once. He built his city there. He named it Ephyra, though it would later come to be called Corinth, the name we still use. Sisyphus's Corinth grew quickly. The city's two harbours, Lycaon on the north and Cenchreae on the south, became busy trading ports. Ships came from across the eastern Mediterranean. Goods moved across the narrow Isthmus on roads that Sisyphus built. The Corinthians prospered. Their king, the cunning Sisyphus, sat at the heart of all this commerce, taking his small portion of every transaction, watching the wealth of his city grow. The Isthmus of Corinth had a particular geographical strangeness that Sisyphus had recognized at once, and that the Greeks of later centuries continued to find useful. The narrow strip of land was only a few miles wide. Ships traveling between the eastern and western Mediterranean had two choices. They could sail all the way around the southern Peloponnese, which was a long, dangerous voyage around the stormy Cape Malea. Or they could come into one of Corinth's harbours, unload their cargo, transport it overland across the isthmus on carts, and reload it onto different ships waiting at the other harbour. The second route was much shorter, but it required the cooperation of whoever controlled the isthmus. Sisyphus and his successors controlled it. They charged for the passage. They built and maintained the roads. They became wealthy on the trade that flowed through their small, narrow land. In some traditions, Sisyphus is also credited with the invention of the small wooden trolleys called the diolkos that were used to pull entire ships overland across the isthmus when the cargo was particularly valuable or when the ship itself needed to be moved. These trolleys ran on a paved stone trackway. Sections of this ancient trackway have been excavated by modern archaeologists. The Corinthian system was sophisticated. Whether Sisyphus himself invented it or whether the credit is poetic exaggeration, the system existed and was associated with the city he had founded. The wealth that flowed into Sisyphus's Corinth was visible in the city's later art and architecture. The Corinthians, in the centuries after Sisyphus, became known for their distinctive style of pottery, with its small black figures painted on a reddish ground. Corinthian pottery was traded across the ancient Mediterranean. Pieces have been found in Italy, in North Africa, in the Black Sea region, in Spain. The Corinthian order of architecture, with its elaborately carved capitals, became one of the three great classical orders alongside the Doric and the Ionic. The Temple of Apollo at Corinth, the foundations of which can still be visited, was one of the impressive religious buildings of the early Greek world. He was, by all accounts, an effective king. The city he built lasted. His foundations were sound. He chose well for his city's site. He organized his markets and his ports with intelligence. The Greeks of later centuries, who often had complicated feelings about him because of his later mythic punishments, nevertheless honored him as the founder of one of their greatest cities. They told stories of his cleverness with a kind of grudging admiration. They knew that without his particular kind of wit, Corinth might never have become what it became. But Sisyphus was also, even in those early days, a man who delighted in cleverness for its own sake. He liked tricks. He liked outwitting opponents. He liked the small satisfaction of having seen a situation more clearly than anyone else around him, and having found in that clearer seeing an advantage that others had missed. This was, in the Greek view, both his strength and his weakness. The same cleverness that built Corinth would eventually, in his old age, bring him to the Underworld and to the famous punishment that has carried his name across thousands of years. The first of his great tricks was at the expense of the river god Asopus. Asopus, whose river ran through Boeotia, not far from Corinth, had a beautiful daughter named Aegina. One day, the old story says, Zeus came to earth in his usual style and carried Aegina away to a small island where he meant to keep her secretly. Asopus, missing his daughter, wandered the Greek mainland looking for her. He came at last to Corinth and asked Sisyphus if he had seen anything that might explain where Aegina had gone. Sisyphus had seen. He had been on the high citadel of Corinth, looking out across the gulf, when he had seen an eagle, or perhaps Zeus himself in some other shape, carrying a young woman through the air toward a distant island. He recognized the shape. He recognized the woman. He understood, with his usual quickness, what was happening. So when Asopus came to him asking, Sisyphus saw an opportunity. He told Asopus that he would tell him where his daughter was, but only in exchange for something. Sisyphus wanted a freshwater spring on the high citadel of Corinth. The citadel, called the Acrocorinth, was a tall, steep rock above the city, and it had no fresh water. This was a strategic weakness. In a siege, the city below could be cut off from the citadel's defenders. Sisyphus wanted a permanent spring up there. Asopus, eager to find his daughter, agreed. He sent his river water up through the rock in some hidden underground way, and a freshwater spring opened at the top of the Acrocorinth. The spring is called Pyrene to this day, and it still flows on the high rock. Sisyphus then told Asopus that Zeus had carried Aegina to the island that would later be called Aegina after her. Asopus rushed to confront Zeus. This was Sisyphus's first mistake. Zeus, the king of the gods, was not a being to be informed upon by a mortal. When Asopus came charging at him on the island demanding his daughter back, Zeus drove him off with thunderbolts. But Zeus also turned his attention to the mortal who had revealed his hiding place. He was angry. He sent Thanatos, the personification of death, to take Sisyphus down to the underworld. This is where the story takes its strangest turn. Sisyphus, when Thanatos arrived to take him away, did not go quietly. He spoke kindly to Thanatos. He invited him in. He suggested that they share a small meal before the long journey to the underworld. Thanatos, perhaps unaccustomed to such hospitality, accepted. He sat down at Sisyphus's table. Sisyphus, while serving the meal, asked Thanatos to show him how the chains that he used to bind mortal souls actually worked. He pretended that he wanted to make sure the chains were secure enough that the journey would be safe. Thanatos, perhaps flattered by the apparent professional interest, demonstrated. He showed Sisyphus how the locks worked. Sisyphus watched carefully, and then, in a moment when Thanatos was distracted, Sisyphus turned the demonstration around. He locked Thanatos in his own chains. For a while, the old tradition says, no mortal could die. Battles were fought, and the wounded did not die. The old and sick simply continued, suffering but not passing on. Death itself was a prisoner in Corinth, chained in a small upper room of Sisyphus's house, unable to perform his usual work. Imagine what this must have been like in the towns and villages of the ancient Mediterranean during those weeks or months. A man wounded in battle, who would normally have died of his wound in a few days, continued instead to lie on his bed in great pain, unable to die, unable to heal, unable to find any rest. An old woman whose time had clearly come, whose family had gathered around her bed to say their farewells, continued instead to breathe, hour after hour, day after day, her family growing exhausted, the candles by her bed burning down one after another, no end to the vigil in sight. A baby, born with a fatal illness, who would normally have slipped away within a few days, instead remained, struggling, suffering, the parents unable to mourn or to hope. The world was, during this strange interval, a place of suspended suffering. The Greeks who told this story understood, in their honest way, that death was not always an enemy. The proper completion of a life included death. To deny death its work was to deny the completion. The fear of death was real, but so was the necessity of death. The old tradition gave Sisyphus credit for the cleverness of chaining Thanatos, but it did not approve of the result. The world without death had been a world of unfinished things, of stalled lives, of prolonged suffering, with no exit. This is one of the deeper old Greek thoughts about Sisyphus. His cleverness in escaping death was, in some sense, a misunderstanding of what death was for. He thought of death only as an enemy. He did not see that death was also a completion, a rest, a release. By chaining Thanatos, he had not made the world better. He had made it worse. He had revealed, by his cleverness, the limits of his own understanding. The man who knew so much about the practical workings of commerce and politics did not, in his cunning soul, know what the cosmos actually needed. The gods, of course, were aware of this. The natural order had been disrupted. Ares, the god of war, was particularly displeased because his battles had become strangely undecided when no one could die. Ares went down to Corinth, found Thanatos, freed him, and brought Sisyphus once again to the threshold of the Underworld. But Sisyphus had prepared for this too. Before Thanatos had come to take him the first time, he had spoken with his wife Merope. He had instructed her, when his death came, not to perform the usual funeral rites. He had told her not to place the coin in his mouth for the ferryman. He had told her not to make the offerings that were due to the underworld gods. He had told her simply to do nothing. Merope, who loved her husband and also feared his cleverness in equal measure, obeyed. When Sisyphus arrived at the gates of the underworld, the proper rites had not been performed for him. Hades, the king of the dead, noticed this irregularity. Sisyphus, when questioned, expressed his great offense that his wife had treated him so disrespectfully. He asked Hades for permission to return to the upper world briefly, just long enough to scold his wife and arrange for the proper rites to be performed. He swore that he would come straight back. Hades, perhaps tired from the long disruption of Thanatos's imprisonment, perhaps slightly fooled by Sisyphus's apparent indignation, agreed. He let Sisyphus go. Sisyphus, of course, did not return. He returned to Corinth, embraced his wife, who had played her part exactly as he had planned, and resumed his life as king. He lived, in some traditions, for many more years, ruling Corinth, watching his city prosper, growing old at his own pace, refusing all summonses from the underworld. This was Sisyphus's second great trick. He had escaped death once by chaining Thanatos. He had escaped it a second time by tricking Hades himself with the false promise to return. The Greeks told these stories with a kind of astonishment. They could hardly believe that a mortal had been so clever. They also understood, even as they admired the cleverness, that there would be consequences. The gods could be tricked, but not forever. The reckoning would come. Good evening and welcome back. If your mind has wandered into the soft middle of the story, the figures have gathered. The cunning king of Corinth, the river god seeking his daughter, the spring on the Corinth, the chained Thanatos in the upper room, the false return from the underworld. You may keep one image. Any one of these is enough to carry the shape of the story forward. The reckoning, when it came, took the form of a punishment so particular and so famous that it has carried Sisyphus's name across thousands of years. When at last he died in great old age and was finally and properly brought down to the underworld, the gods gathered to decide what to do with him. He had defied them too completely to be simply admitted to the regular shades of the asphodel meadows. He had to be marked. He had to be given a punishment that would not let his rebellion ever be forgotten. The punishment they devised is one of the strangest in all old mythology. Sisyphus was given a great boulder. He was placed at the foot of a long, steep hill in the underworld. He was told to roll the boulder to the top of the hill, and then, just as he was reaching the summit, the boulder would slip from his hands and roll back down to the foot of the hill. He would have to descend, find the boulder, and begin again, and again, and again, forever. This is the famous punishment of Sisyphus, the one that has become a kind of proverb in many languages, the one that gives us the adjective Sisyphean for any task that seems endless and pointless. The image is simple and harsh. A man, an enormous stone, a hill, the slow effort of pushing the stone upward, the moment of near success at the top, the stone rolling back down, the slow descent to begin again. The Greeks themselves told this story with a certain ambivalence. They felt the harshness of the punishment. They also felt that it was in some way fitting. Sisyphus had spent his mortal life outwitting the natural order. He had refused death twice. He had thought himself cleverer than the gods. The punishment was a kind of mirror to his life. It gave him an endless task. It denied him any final completion. It made his cleverness useless. The man who had outwitted death was now given a labor that no amount of cleverness could finish. But there is something else in the story too, something the older Greek poets understood, but did not always say aloud. The punishment is harsh, yes, but it is also, in a strange way, a continuation of Sisyphus's life rather than its negation. Sisyphus had always been a man of effort. He had built a city. He had organized commerce. He had managed harbors. He had performed many small daily acts of intelligent labor. The underworld did not actually end this. It only stripped away the meaning. The work continued. The cleverness was now useless, but the effort itself, the pushing of a heavy thing up a slope, was still recognizably Sisyphus's. He did, in some sense, what he had always done. He worked. The French writer Albert Camus in the 20th century wrote a famous essay about this. He suggested that Sisyphus, at the bottom of the slope, returning to begin again, was actually a figure of strange dignity. The work was meaningless, but the worker was conscious of his work. He chose, in some sense, to continue. He could have refused. He could have lain down beside the boulder and given up. But he did not. He returned to the boulder. He began again. Camus suggested that we must imagine Sisyphus happy. This is a modern interpretation, and we do not have to accept it. The older Greek tradition was less generous to Sisyphus. He was a punished man, in the older view, and his punishment was just. The Greeks did not romanticize him as Camus did, but the Camus reading, even if not faithful to the older tradition, does point at something real in the image. The endless work, performed without hope of completion, is also a kind of life. It is a strange life. It is not the life the worker would have chosen, but it is not, in some deep way, less of a life than any other. There is, perhaps, a sleep-friendly thought in this. The day's work, when it is honest, often has something Sisyphean in it. The dishes are washed today, and tomorrow there will be more dishes. The bed is made today, and tonight it will need to be made again. The bills are paid this month, and next month there will be new bills. The small daily labours of human life return again and again, regardless of how often they are completed. To live in a real sense is to push small boulders up small slopes endlessly. The dignity of this kind of life is not always obvious, but it is real. The endless small labours, done with patience, with attention, with the willingness to begin again tomorrow, are themselves a kind of life. This is what Sisyphus, in the older Greek tradition, may have come to understand on his slope. We do not know, the myth does not say, but the image of him, his hands on the stone, his slow, patient ascent, his arrival at the summit, the stone slipping, his descent, his beginning again, is one that has comforted as many readers as it has disturbed. The image is harsh, but the image is also familiar. The image is, perhaps, the truest image of an ordinary human life. We do work that returns. We finish things that begin again. We complete tasks that need completing again tomorrow. The Greeks of the historical period, when they thought about Sisyphus, often connected him to other figures who had been similarly punished in the underworld. There was Tantalus, who stood in water that receded when he tried to drink, beneath fruit that lifted away when he tried to eat. There was Ixion, bound to a wheel of fire that turned forever. There was Tityos, whose liver was eaten by vultures forever. These were the famous sufferers of the underworld, the figures whose punishments had become proverbial. Sisyphus was one of them. His punishment was perhaps the most famous, but he was not alone. Tantalus, the most senior of the punished sufferers, had been a king of Lydia, a wealthy ruler who had been close enough to the gods to dine at their tables. His crime in the old tradition had been to serve them a meal in which he had included the flesh of his own son, Pelops. He had wanted to test whether the gods would notice. They had noticed. Demeter, distracted by her grief over Persephone, had eaten a small portion of the meat before catching herself. The other gods restored Pelops to life, replacing the eaten shoulder with a piece of ivory. Tantalus was sent to the underworld for his offense. His punishment was to stand forever in water that receded when he bent to drink, beneath fruit that lifted away when he reached to pluck it. The English word tantalizing comes from his name. The eternal nearness of what cannot be reached has been associated with him ever since. Ixion, another of the great sufferers, had been a king of Thessaly. He had committed several crimes that led to his punishment. He had killed his father-in-law to avoid paying the bride price for his wife. Zeus, in some traditions, had taken pity on him and brought him up to Olympus to be cleansed of this crime, but Ixion, once on Olympus, had attempted to seduce Hera. Hera complained to Zeus. Zeus, to test whether Ixion's intent was real or imagined, sent a cloud shaped like Hera to deceive him. Ixion, fooled by the cloud, made love to it. From this strange union came the centaurs, the half-human, half-horse beings who roamed the Greek mountains thereafter. For his attempted offense against Hera, Ixion was punished. He was bound to a great wheel of fire that turned forever in the air of the underworld. He spun perpetually, his body wrapped in flame, never able to escape. Tityos was a giant son of Earth who had attempted to violate Leto, the mother of Apollo and Artemis. Apollo and Artemis killed him with their arrows. In the underworld, his enormous body was stretched out across 9 acres of ground, and 2 vultures came every day to tear at his liver. The liver, immortal as the giant himself was immortal, grew back each night. The vultures returned each morning. The torment was endless. These 4 figures, Tantalus, Ixion, Tityos, and Sisyphus, formed a kind of council of the famously punished in the old Greek underworld. Other lesser figures suffered in similar ways, but these 4 were the most cited, the most often invoked in proverbs, the most commonly painted on the walls of underworld scenes in vase art and tomb art. To be sent to join them was, in the Greek imagination, the worst kind of afterlife. Death was not the worst thing. The worst thing was unending punishment for an unforgivable offense against the gods. The Greeks thought carefully about why some figures received this kind of punishment and others did not. The criteria were not always consistent across traditions, but certain themes recurred. The 4 great sufferers had all, in different ways, claimed too much. Tantalus had claimed to share the gods' meals as an equal and had tested them with his terrible meal. Ixion had claimed Hera, the wife of Zeus, as his own. Tityos had claimed Leto by force. Sisyphus had claimed to outwit the gods themselves and to refuse death twice. The common thread was hubris in its deepest form, the assertion of equality with or superiority over the immortal powers of the cosmos. The gods could forgive many things, the old Greek tradition suggested, but they could not forgive this. The lesson was not lost on the Greek listeners. They knew that to be too proud, to claim too much for oneself, to test the patience of the gods, was the most dangerous of the human mistakes. The punishments in the underworld were the visible mythological warnings. Behind the warnings lay a more general philosophical lesson. The human being lives best when they accept their place in the cosmos, when they do not try to climb above their proper station, when they perform their work with attention, but without the conviction that they are special. The 4 great sufferers had all forgotten this. Their punishments were the eternal reminders. The poet Homer in the Odyssey has Odysseus see Sisyphus during his journey to the underworld. The passage is brief but unforgettable. Odysseus describes the king of Corinth at his work, the sweat on his shoulders, the effort of his muscles, the stone almost at the top, the stone slipping, the slow rolling down to the base, Sisyphus beginning again. Homer's image is what most later imaginings have drawn from. The sleep tone here, the slow effort and the slow defeat repeated, has something almost like quiet poetry to it, even as the situation is harsh. What sort of man was Sisyphus in life before the underworld? The old stories give us some glimpses. He was clever, as we have seen. He was a city builder. He was a husband, though not always a faithful one. He had several sons, the most famous of whom was Glaucus, the father of Bellerophon, the hero who would later tame the winged horse Pegasus. He had quarrels with neighboring kings, including his brother Salmoneus, who claimed equality with Zeus and was struck down for it. He had relationships with traveling traders, with sailors, with merchants from across the Mediterranean. He was, in some sense, a worldly figure, a man who knew the practical workings of commerce and politics far better than he knew the deeper laws of fate. His wife Merope was one of the Pleiades, the 7 daughters of the Titan Atlas. The Pleiades, after various adventures and after various of them had been pursued by gods and heroes, were eventually placed in the sky as the star cluster that bears their name. 6 of the stars are easily visible. The 7th is dim. The old tradition explained the dimness by saying that Merope, the 7th sister, was ashamed because she had married a mortal rather than a god, and a mortal who had been condemned to the underworld at that. She hid her face. The 7th Pleiad is dim because Merope cannot bear to look upon the world that knew her husband as a punished man. This is a tender detail. In the larger story, even in his punishment, Sisyphus had been loved. Merope had stood by him through the trick with Thanatos and through the trick with Hades. She had played her part in his second escape from death. She had remained faithful to him throughout his long, late life, and after his final death and his final punishment, she had taken her sadness with her into the night sky, where she still hides her face among her brighter sisters. The cunning king was not, in this telling, a man without love. He had had a wife who loved him enough to grieve for him forever. His son Glaucus was a king of Corinth after him in the brief period between Sisyphus's final death and the rise of later dynasties. Glaucus was, in some traditions, also a clever man, though not as clever as his father. He fed his horses on human flesh, in some old story, in order to make them fiercer in chariot races. The horses, made wild by this diet, eventually turned on him and tore him apart. This was an old warning about the dangers of seeking unfair advantage. Glaucus had wanted to win races. He had been willing to corrupt his horses to do it. The horses, corrupted, had become his end. His grandson Bellerophon was a more straightforward hero, the man who tamed the winged horse Pegasus and who killed the Chimera, a fire-breathing monster with the body of a lion, the head of a goat, and the tail of a serpent. Bellerophon's story is one of the bright hero stories of Greek myth, but it too ends with a fall. Bellerophon, having achieved great deeds, grew proud. He tried to fly Pegasus up to Olympus to dine with the gods. The gods, offended, sent a gadfly to sting Pegasus, who threw Bellerophon from his back. Bellerophon fell to earth and lived out his old age as a crippled and bitter man, wandering the plains of Elaon, shunned by mortals and gods alike. The Sisyphean line had its pattern: cleverness, hubris, fall. Each generation made its own version of the pattern. Sisyphus's brother Salmoneus had his own famous fate. Salmoneus was the king of Elis in the western Peloponnese. He had grown so proud of his own kingship that he had begun to claim equality with Zeus. He had built a bronze chariot which, when driven across a bronze bridge, made a sound like thunder. He had thrown burning torches across the sky to imitate lightning. He had ordered his subjects to worship him in place of Zeus. The Greeks told this story as a warning about the dangers of impiety. Zeus, hearing of Salmoneus's pretensions, struck him with a real thunderbolt and destroyed his whole city. The contrast with Sisyphus is interesting. Sisyphus had been clever enough not to claim equality with the gods outright. He had only tried to outwit them in small ways. Salmoneus had claimed too much too openly, and his punishment had been swift and complete. Sisyphus's punishment, by being subtler and slower, was perhaps more famous in the long run. But both brothers had crossed the line in different ways between mortal cleverness and divine reach. There were quieter members of the family too. Sisyphus had other sons whom the old stories barely mention: Ornician, Almus, Thersander. These were ordinary princes who succeeded one another in Corinth without dramatic events. They lived their lives. They ruled their city. They were buried in the ancestral tombs. Their names appear in the genealogies, but their stories were not told because they did not need to be told. Sometimes the descendants of a mythic figure are simply, blessedly, ordinary. This branching out of Sisyphus's family into both dramatic and ordinary descendants is one of the small, generous features of Greek mythology. The dramatic lines, with their tragic falls and their famous deaths, were balanced by the quieter lines that continued without incident. A family could include a Bellerophon and an Ornithion, a tragedy, and a quiet succession. The old Greeks understood that families were like this. Every dynasty has its bright, dramatic members and its quietly working members. The bright ones got the songs. The quiet ones got the actual long inheritance of the family's continuation. This worldly cleverness was both his strength and his limit. He could outsmart any mortal he met. He could outwit, for a time, even the gods. But he could not, in the end, outwit the underlying order of the cosmos. The natural cycle of birth and death is older than cleverness. The boulder on his slope is, in some sense, a representation of this older order, finally asserting itself against his cleverness. The stone is heavy because the cosmos itself is heavy. The slope is long because the cosmos is long. The repetition is endless because the cosmos has no patience for tricks that try to end it. We are coming toward the end of the night's telling. The boulder still rolls on Sisyphus's slope, somewhere in the underworld imagination of the old Greeks, and will continue to roll. But the listener does not need to keep watching it. The listener may rest. Before we move toward the closing, there are a few more small details of the Sisyphean tradition worth mentioning, because the old Greeks developed his story in various directions across many centuries, and certain of those branches deserve a brief light. In some traditions, Sisyphus was not only the founder of Corinth, but also the inventor of certain practical innovations that the Greeks credited him with. Navigation by the stars, certain methods of accounting for trade goods, certain ways of marking the property boundaries between farmers. None of these inventions are historically verifiable, of course. They are traditional associations rather than archaeological facts. But the Greeks of later centuries connected various practical inventions to the legendary founder of their commercial city, the way later peoples might connect inventions to a famous local figure of the past. Sisyphus, in this folk memory, became the patron of practical cleverness, the inventor of small, useful tricks of the kind that ordinary traders and craftsmen used every day. There was a small cult of Sisyphus at Corinth in the historical period, though it was a minor one. Travelers to the city were sometimes shown the supposed tomb of the Cunning king on the slopes of the Acra Corinth. The tomb was an ancient stone structure, certainly older than the historical Greek period, perhaps from the Mycenaean era. The local guides told the story of Sisyphus to visiting pilgrims with various small embellishments. The tomb was not a major religious site. It was simply a curiosity, a local memory, a small mark in the landscape that connected the city to its legendary founder. In Roman times, Sisyphus appeared in the underworld scenes of various Latin poems. Virgil, in the Aeneid, includes him among the punished figures Aeneas sees during his journey to the underworld. Ovid, in the Metamorphoses, describes the punishment in some of his most vivid lines. Lucretius, the Epicurean philosopher, uses Sisyphus as an allegorical figure, the politician who endlessly seeks power, who rolls his boulder up the slope of his ambition only to have it roll back when he is rejected by the voters. The Roman uses of Sisyphus tended to be more philosophical and allegorical than the older Greek uses had been. The Romans were more interested in moral lessons than in literal mythology. In the medieval period after the rise of Christianity, Sisyphus continued to appear as a figure of punishment, though his particular pagan context was sometimes forgotten. He was sometimes shown in Christian art as a generic suffering damned soul, with his boulder, without the surrounding Greek story. The image had become detached from its origin. It was simply the image of endless punishment for the unrepentant. In the Renaissance, when European scholars rediscovered the classical texts, the full story of Sisyphus was rediscovered as well. He began to appear in paintings and engravings of the underworld scenes, often as a figure on a hillside in the background, working at his stone, while in the foreground other punished figures performed their own punishments. The Renaissance treatment was sometimes sympathetic, particularly when paired with humanist discussions of the dignity of human labor. The endless work of Sisyphus could be seen in some readings as the long human inheritance of effort, with the punishment aspect somewhat softened. The modern existentialist reading of Sisyphus, particularly Camus's, was anticipated in certain late 19th century writers. Schopenhauer, the German philosopher of pessimism, had used the image of Sisyphus to describe the human will, which strives endlessly without final satisfaction. Nietzsche, in his complex writings, had touched on the theme of eternal return, in which every action is fated to repeat itself across endless cycles of time, an idea with some Sisyphean resonance. By the time Camus wrote his essay, the philosophical ground had been prepared. Sisyphus was already a figure that modern thinkers used to explore questions about meaning, repetition, and the dignity of work in the absence of a final goal. Camus's essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, was published in 1942 during the German occupation of France. It belongs to that strange, dark moment of European history. Camus argued that the modern human being, having lost the consolation of religious meaning, was in a situation analogous to Sisyphus's. The work continues. The completion never arrives. The question is how to live with this. Camus's answer was that consciousness itself was enough. To be aware of the absurdity of one's situation and to continue working anyway was a kind of victory. The boulder did not have to be redeemed by some external meaning. The pushing of the boulder, performed with full awareness of its uselessness, was itself the meaning. This reading has been contested in various ways. Some have suggested that Camus made Sisyphus too cheerful, that the older Greek understanding of the punishment as actual suffering was lost in the modern philosophical optimism. Others have suggested that Camus did not go far enough, that even the consolation of consciousness was a kind of false comfort. The debate continues, but the figure of Sisyphus, pushed by Camus into the center of modern philosophical discussion, has remained there. He is perhaps the most discussed mythic figure of modern times, more discussed than Oedipus, more discussed than Prometheus, more discussed than Odysseus. The man with the boulder has become a kind of symbol of the modern condition. There is a question worth pausing on before we close. Why has this particular story lasted so long? Of all the punishments in the old underworld, why is the Sisyphean one the one that has carried into modern language, into modern conversation, into modern reflection on the meaning of work? The other underworld punishments, Tantalus and Ixion and Tityos, are less commonly invoked, but Sisyphus is everywhere. His name is a modifier. His task is a metaphor. His situation is a parable that does not need explanation. Part of the reason, perhaps, is that the Sisyphean task is the most universal. Tantalus is a particular kind of suffering, the suffering of unfulfilled desire close at hand. Ixion is a particular kind of suffering, the suffering of betrayal punished. Tityos is a particular kind of suffering, the suffering of violation answered with bodily torment. But Sisyphus is suffering in its most ordinary form, the work that does not complete. Every life has some version of this. Every job has some Sisyphean element. Every household has its repeated daily tasks. The image fits the universal experience. Another reason, perhaps, is that the image is also, in its way, restful. The other punishments are agonizing. The water and food just out of reach, the wheel of fire, the gnawing at the liver, these are images of acute suffering. Sisyphus's punishment is not acute, it is steady. It is the slow, patient pushing of a stone. The work is hard, but it is not torture in the same way. There is in the steadiness something almost meditative. The boulder is heavy, the slope is long, but the worker walks. He pushes, he walks back, he pushes again. The repetition has its own rhythm. The rhythm, the old singers may have understood, is the rhythm of every long human task. For the listener tonight, this might be worth carrying gently into sleep. The day's small Sisyphean tasks, the things that return today and will return tomorrow, are not necessarily a burden in the way the underworld punishments suggest. They are also a rhythm. They are the slow, steady work of a life that continues. The bed will need to be made again tomorrow. The food will need to be prepared. The small kindnesses will need to be repeated. None of these things finish. None of them stay finished. But the doing of them slowly and well is itself a kind of life. There is something old and deeply human about this rhythm of endlessly returning tasks. Long before any city was built, long before Corinth was founded, long before Sisyphus thought up his clever tricks, human beings were already doing the small daily labor of staying alive. The hunting of small animals, the gathering of plants, the carrying of water, the tending of fires, the mending of clothes, the teaching of children, none of these tasks finished. None of them stayed finished. They returned every day for as long as human beings have existed. The Sisyphean shape of life is not new. It is older than any myth. The myth simply gives it a name, makes it visible, allows us to recognize the pattern that has always been there. The dignity of these returning tasks is something the old Greek imagination understood at certain moments and forgot at others. The heroes' stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey focus on the dramatic deeds, the wars, the voyages, the great encounters. The smaller daily work that supported all those dramatic deeds is often invisible in the heroic poetry, but it was there. Penelope, in the Odyssey, weaving her endless cloth that she unravelled each night, doing one of the most Sisyphean of all the mythological labours, is the quiet counterpart to the loud adventures of her husband. Her work, like Sisyphus's, was endless. Unlike his, it was a choice, a strategy, a way of keeping her unwanted suitors at bay. but the shape was the same, cloth woven by day, cloth unravelled by night, cloth begun again the next morning. The pattern of patient, repeated labour is not always punishment. Sometimes it is wisdom. The image of Penelope at her loom, balancing the image of Sisyphus on his slope, gives us two different angles on the same fundamental shape of human work. Penelope's repetition is purposeful. She is buying time. She is waiting for her husband. Her endless task has a hidden goal, even if the work itself appears to be endless. Sisyphus's repetition in the Greek view was punishment without purpose, but the modern Camus reading suggests that the difference is smaller than it appears. Even Sisyphus, in his consciousness of his work, was choosing in some sense. The continuing was a choice. The not lying down beside the boulder was a choice. The returning to the work was a choice. The Greek and the modern readings taken together give us a richer picture than either alone. For the listener tonight, then, the Sisyphean image can be received without too much heaviness. The work that returns is, in some sense, the work that keeps us. The work that finishes is, in some sense, a small death. The work that does not finish is the work of being alive. Tonight, you set the work aside. Tomorrow you return to it. The cycle is not a curse. It is, more deeply considered, simply the shape of a life that continues. It simply was in the old Greek imagination that even punishment had its own dignity if it was steady. Sisyphus on his slope was suffering, but he was also working, and the working was, in some sense, what kept him present. To stop pushing the boulder would have been a different kind of death than the one he had escaped. The endless task was a kind of staying alive, even in the underworld. There is one more strand of the older tradition worth mentioning. In some local Corinthian stories, Sisyphus was honored not only as a punished sufferer, but also as a kind of trickster hero, the founder, who had been clever enough to outwit even death. The local Corinthians, telling their city's story, sometimes emphasized the achievements of his life rather than the harshness of his afterlife. They told of the spring he had won from Asopus. They told of the chained Thanatos in his upper room. They told of the false return from the underworld. They told of his long, late life as king. The punishment with the boulder was, in these local tellings, a kind of footnote, not the center of his story. The center, for the Corinthians, was his cleverness in life. This is one of the small, lovely features of Greek local mythology. The same figure could be honored in one place and condemned in another. The Corinthians saw Sisyphus as their founder. The Athenians saw him as a famous sufferer. The philosophers saw him as a cautionary tale. The modern readers see him as an existential parable. Each tradition emphasized different aspects of the same long story. Each tradition was, in its own way, faithful to the figure. The cunning king was many things at once, and the various tellings of his story preserve those many things. This is, in some sense, the gentlest old Greek thought about Sisyphus. He was not only the punished, he was also the founder, the trickster, the husband of Merope, the father of Glaucus, the grandfather of Bellerophon, the king who built one of the great cities of his world. The boulder is one image. The other images are also real. To remember only the boulder is to forget the rest. To remember only the founding is to forget the punishment. The full figure includes both. There is a kindness in this complexity. The old Greeks did not let their mythological figures be flattened into single morals. They allowed Sisyphus to be both the punished man and the city founder. They allowed Hercules to be both the great hero and the killer of his own family in madness. They allowed Achilles to be both the unmatched warrior and the petulant young man who refused to fight. They allowed their figures to be full. They did not require the simple lessons that later moralizing traditions would sometimes try to extract from the myths. For the listener tonight, this complexity may be worth carrying gently. Your own life, when looked at from the outside, will not yield a single neat moral either. It contains its own founders and its own sufferers, its own cleverness and its own punishments, its own bright achievements and its own quiet shames. The old Greeks would have allowed you to be all of these things at once. They would not have required you to be reduced to a single story. They would have honored the complexity, the way they honored Sisyphus with all his contradictions intact. This is one of the strange, tender truths of the old myth. The punishment was harsh, but the worker remained. The boulder kept Sisyphus among the visible figures of the underworld. Other shades, in the asphodel meadows, faded into a kind of dim half-existence. Sisyphus was always visible, he was always working, he was always there. The punishment had, in some sense, given him an immortality of presence that the ordinary dead did not have. He was the man on the slope, and that was what he would be, forever. Consider how this thought might apply to ordinary mortal experience. Most of us, in the long course of our lives, do work whose final purpose is not always clear. The teacher teaches generation after generation of students, knowing that they will leave and that new students will come. The farmer plants seeds in the spring and harvests in the autumn, knowing that next spring there will be more seeds to plant. The nurse cares for patients who recover and go home and are replaced by other patients who arrive. The cook prepares meals that are eaten and forgotten and must be prepared again. None of this is exactly Sisyphean in the sense of being a punishment, but the shape of the work, the returning task, the lack of any final completion is similar. The old Greek understanding of Sisyphus suggested that this kind of work was a kind of suffering. The modern Camus reading suggested that it was a kind of dignity. The truth, perhaps, is somewhere in between. The endless task can be both. It can be heavy at times, it can be light at times, it can be a burden when one is tired, it can be a kind of rhythm when one is at ease. The shape of the work does not, by itself, determine the experience. The experience is determined by the worker's relationship to the work, and that relationship can change from day to day, hour to hour, even moment to moment. For the listener tonight, you may carry whichever version of the thought feels more useful in this hour. If your day was heavy, the Sisyphean shape of life may feel like a real weight. If your day was light, the Sisyphean shape may feel like a familiar, friendly rhythm. Both responses are honest. Both are part of the long human experience that the old myth captures. The boulder is heavy, and the boulder is familiar. The slope is long, and the slope is known. The worker continues in either mood. The continuing is, finally, the thing. But that is a story for another day, the way the philosophical and literary interpretations of Sisyphus have multiplied in the modern world. Tonight, we will only mark it. We will only carry from the long telling the simple image, the man, the stone, the slope, the slow effort, the slow defeat, the slow ascent that begins again. For now, remember this. The work that returns is also, in its way, the work that keeps us. The bed made today and remade tomorrow is the bed of a life that continues. The meal cooked today and cooked again tomorrow is the meal of a household that endures. The small task that has to be done again next week is the small task of a person who is still here, still doing things, still pushing the small daily stones up the small daily slopes. Tonight, you may rest from this work. Sleep is its own answer to the endless boulder. In sleep, the stone is set down. In sleep, the slope is left for the morning. Before we gather the figures and let them settle, there is one more small image worth pausing on. The Greeks who carved underworld scenes on their tomb walls sometimes showed Sisyphus at a particular moment, not at the bottom of the slope, beginning again, and not at the top, where the boulder is about to slip, but somewhere in the middle of his slow ascent. The image of him in the middle is, in some sense, the truest. The work is happening. The effort is real. The end is not yet reached. The beginning has been left behind. He is in the long middle of the task, where most life actually takes place. It is in this middle that the worker, whether mythic or mortal, finds whatever meaning the work has. The beginning is too early to know. The end, when it comes, is too quick to register. The middle is where the dignity, if there is any dignity, actually lives. The long, slow, patient effort, performed in the dim middle of the slope, is what makes the worker a worker. The image is gentle in its way. It honors the slow, steady part of any task that is worth doing. For the listener tonight, you are perhaps somewhere in the middle of your own slope, whatever that slope happens to be. The day's work is set aside. Tomorrow's work has not yet begun. You are between. The night is your dim middle. The rest between the efforts, the small mercy of stopping for a few hours before the next push. The old Greeks understood the value of this kind of pause. The sleep was sacred. It was the small mercy that even Sisyphus, in some merciful traditions, was granted at the end of each pushing of the boulder. He did, in some imaginings, rest at the bottom of the slope for a small interval before beginning again. Even the endless task included its small rests. The listener tonight is in such a small rest. The morning will come. The boulder in your life will need to be pushed again. But for now, you may rest. The night is older now, and the story has carried us far. Let us gather the figures and let them settle. Sisyphus, the cunning king of Corinth, the founder of one of the great cities of the Peloponnese, the spring of Pyrene on the Acrocorinth, given by Asopus in exchange for information. The chained Thanatos in the upper room of the king's house while no one in the world could die. The false return from the underworld, the unperformed funeral rites, the angry husband come back from death to scold his obedient wife, the long, late life of the king ruling his prosperous city, watching his harbours grow, finally dying of old age in his own bed, the underworld at last, the gathered gods, the decision about his punishment, the boulder, the slope, the slow ascent, the slipping, the descent, the endless beginning again. The constellation of suffering figures in Tartarus, Tantalus with his fruit, Ixion on his wheel, Tityos with his vultures, the brief glimpse Odysseus has of Sisyphus during his own underworld voyage, the Camus essay of the 20th century, the suggestion that we must imagine Sisyphus happy. There is one more strand of his story, sometimes mentioned in the old tradition, that deserves a brief light, the question of his attribute as a possible father of Odysseus. Some traditions, particularly later and more scurrilous ones, claimed that Sisyphus had been the secret father of Odysseus rather than Laertes, the official father. The story was that Sisyphus had visited Laertes' wife Anticlea before her marriage. Whether this story was originally told to honor Odysseus by giving him the cleverness of the most cunning of mortal kings, or whether it was told to dishonor him by making his birth questionable, depended on the teller. The more sympathetic readers took it as a way of explaining Odysseus's particular wit. The less sympathetic took it as a slight on his legitimacy. Either way, the story shows how Sisyphus's reputation for cleverness was so strong that later traditions could not resist trying to connect him to Odysseus, the other great clever figure of Greek mythology. The two cunning men in this alternative tradition were father and son. This connection is probably not the original telling. Most ancient sources have Odysseus as the legitimate son of Laertes, but the alternative tradition shows how Sisyphus's name had become almost a synonym for cleverness itself. To suggest that someone was actually Sisyphus's son was to suggest that they were even more clever than they appeared. The compliment, if it was a compliment, was extreme. These are the figures of Sisyphus's mythology, and you do not have to hold them. They are mentioned only so that they may settle. Let the names drift down like stones into water. Let the images soften. Let the long history of the man on the slope become a quiet weight in the room, the way a held stone is a quiet weight, holding without insisting. The Corinth that Sisyphus founded continued to be one of the great cities of the Greek world for many centuries after his death. It was a wealthy commercial center. It was sometimes a rival to Athens. It was destroyed by the Romans in 146 BC and rebuilt by Julius Caesar 100 years later as a Roman colony. The new Roman Corinth was where the Christian apostle Paul preached in the 1st century of our era, writing the letters to the Corinthians that became part of the New Testament. The city that the cunning king had founded lasted in various forms for nearly 2,000 years. His foundation was good. His city was a real city. Whatever the harshness of his underworld fate, his work in the upper world had built something that endured. In the historical period, Corinth was famous for many things beyond its commerce. It hosted the Isthmian Games, one of the 4 great Pan-Hellenic athletic festivals, alongside the Olympic, Pythian, and Nemean Games. These games were held every 2 years on the Isthmus of Corinth, in honor of Poseidon. Athletes came from across the Greek world to compete. Victors received crowns of pine, the local sacred tree associated with the games. The Isthmian Games continued for many centuries, well into the Roman period. The careful organization of such a long-running athletic festival was, in some sense, a Sisyphean labor itself. Every 2 years, the games had to be organized again. Every 2 years, new athletes had to be welcomed, new contests held, new crowns awarded. The work of the festival did not finish, it returned, and it carried across centuries a kind of cultural memory that connected one generation of Greeks to another. Corinth was also famous for its temple of Aphrodite on the Acrocorinth, the high citadel where Sisyphus had once installed the spring of Pyrene. The temple of Aphrodite was, in some traditions, a major sanctuary with many priestesses. The wealth of the temple, supported by the wealthy commerce of the city below, was significant. Pilgrims came from across the Mediterranean. The temple, like the city itself, lasted for many centuries. The Pyrene spring that Sisyphus had won from Asopus continued to flow at the top of the Corinth throughout the historical period and indeed into modern times. Visitors to the site today can still see the spring, now enclosed in a small medieval structure built on top of the ancient one. The water still rises out of the rock, cool and clear, as it has done since the day the river god Asopus channeled his river through the underground passages to fulfill his side of the bargain. The spring is, in its way, the most lasting trace of Sisyphus in the upper world. The boulder rolls forever in the underworld. In the imagination, the spring flows forever on the Corinth, in the real, visible world. Both are testimonies in different ways to the cunning king of Corinth. The Corinth itself, with its long views in every direction, remains one of the most spectacular high places in Greece. From its summit, you can see the Saronic Gulf to the east and the Corinthian Gulf to the west. You can see the mountains of mainland Greece to the north and the mountains of the Peloponnese to the south. You can see, on a clear day, the high Parnassus, where Apollo's oracle once spoke. The setting is grand. Sisyphus, who chose this place for his city, had chosen well. The Corinth is a place that any king would have wanted to build his citadel on. The view itself, even today, gives a sense of why the cunning king had been so successful in his commercial city. From here, he could see everything. From here, he could understand the geography of the Eastern Mediterranean at a single glance. The cleverness that founded his city had begun with this view. This is part of the strange complexity of Sisyphus's story. He is, in the underworld, the figure of endless, useless labor. But in the upper world, his labor had been useful. He had built Corinth. He had organized its harbors. He had made his city prosper. The same hands that would later push the underworld boulder had also, in their mortal time, built one of the great cities of Greek civilization. The cleverness that brought him to his punishment had also been the cleverness that gave the Greek world one of its centers. The old Greeks understood this contradiction. They did not try to resolve it. They allowed Sisyphus to be both the punished man on the slope and the city-founding king. The contradiction was, in their imagination, part of what made him interesting. Now, let the story loosen, the way every long-telling must when sleep approaches. Let the boulder rest, in your imagination, at the bottom of the slope. Let Sisyphus, for tonight, lie beside it rather than push it. Let the underworld be quiet. Let the asphodel meadows extend in their pale, dim light. Let the souls, who have never been punished, move slowly among the flowers, the way they have moved for thousands of years. Let Tantalus put down his fruit. Let Ixion's wheels slow and stop. Let Tityos's vultures roost in some far branch and close their eyes. Let the whole underworld rest for the length of one mortal sleep. Let the city of Corinth also rest in the upper world, with its harbours quiet at night and its citadel dark against the stars. Let the spring of Pyrene continue to flow, as it has flowed for so many centuries, its water cool and patient, asking nothing of anyone. Let the small olive trees on the slopes of the Isthmus stir in the night wind, their silver-grey leaves catching the moonlight. Let the ships in the harbours rock gently at their moorings, with no cargo being loaded or unloaded until morning. Let the Corinthians, in their houses and their workshops, sleep the simple sleep of people whose city is prosperous and whose work will return tomorrow. Let Merope, the seventh Pleiad, hold her dim place in the night sky among her brighter sisters, hiding her face from the world that knew her husband as a punished man. Let her sadness be honored, but let it also rest. The grief is real. The grief has been carried for thousands of years. Tonight she may, in your imagination, let it rest for a few hours. Let the long arc of Sisyphus's family settle. Let Glaucus, who fed his horses on human flesh, rest beside his torn body. Let Bellerophon, the fallen hero, lie at last in some quiet place where the gadfly cannot find him. Let Ornitian and Almus and Thersander, the ordinary princes whose names appear in the genealogies, but whose stories were not told, rest with their forgotten dignity intact. Let Salmoneus, the brother who claimed equality with Zeus and was struck down, rest in whatever place the cosmos has finally allowed him. Let the whole branching family tree of Sisyphus settle into the night, generation after generation, dramatic and ordinary together. Let the Isthmian games be quiet. Let the pine crowns lie in their storage chests, waiting for the next set of victors 2 years hence. Let the temple of Aphrodite on the Corinth be dark, its priestesses asleep in their small chambers. Let the small medieval structure built over the spring of Pyrene be silent, the water continuing to flow beneath it, the spring still doing its slow, patient work even when no one is watching. Let the Roman ruins of the city, with their broken columns, settle into the night, the moonlight falling across them as it has fallen for so many centuries. Good evening and welcome back, one last time, to the slow, gentle work of letting the story rest. The night has carried Sisyphus a long way, from the founding of a great city to the endless slope of the underworld, to the long modern reflection on what such labor might mean. There are many other tellings of him, many other small mythic details, many other ways the Greeks remembered him. But that is a story for another day. The slope of his mythology is wide enough that no single knight can walk all its paths. The figure of Sisyphus, taken as a whole, gives us several different gifts. He gives us a great founding myth of one of the central commercial cities of the old Greek world. He gives us a meditation on the limits of cleverness, on the moment when cunning meets the deeper fabric of the cosmos and finds that cunning is not always enough. He gives us one of the most enduring images of human labor, the man on the slope, the boulder, the endless beginning again. He gives us, through the modern philosophical reading, a way to think about meaning in lives that do not have a final completion. He gives us, through his family, a series of further stories about hubris and fall, about the patterns that repeat across generations. He gives us, through Merope and the dim Pleiad, a tender image of the love that survived even the harshest of underworld fates. He gives us, through his city, a real geographical and historical presence that lasted nearly 2,000 years. This is a lot of gifts from one mythic figure. The old Greeks were good at this kind of layering. They allowed their figures to carry many meanings at once. Sisyphus is heavier than the others, perhaps, because his story has been used so many ways. But he was, at the root, simply a clever king of Corinth who tried to outwit death and who was finally given a famous punishment. The rest is what the long centuries have added to him. The listener tonight, who has carried the story this far, may carry whichever gift is most useful. The boulder is heavy. The boulder is also familiar. The slope is long. The slope is also known. The continuing is, finally, the thing. There is a final image worth carrying. The boulder, in your imagination, sits at the bottom of the slope. It is dim in the underworld twilight. Sisyphus stands beside it. He is tired, but not destroyed. The slope rises above him, long and steady. The summit far above is visible in outline. He has done this thousands of times. He will do it thousands of times more. But for this moment, before he places his hands on the stone, he is simply standing. He is breathing. He is, in his strange way, at rest. The work has not yet begun. The work has not finished. He is in the small pause that even the most endless task contains. This is the truest image to carry into sleep tonight. The pause before the work, the breath before the effort, the small interval in which the worker is just a person, just a body, just a slow, steady presence in the dim light. The boulder will be pushed again, but for now it is set down. The slope is there, but not being climbed. The worker is briefly, simply present. For now, remember this. Tonight, the work of the tale is done. It simply was, like all old stories, the carrying of the cunning king and the endless boulder through the long inheritance of nights. Let the names settle. Let the room settle. Let the night gather you up. Imagine the long slope of Sisyphus far behind you, the boulder and the long ascent and the long descent no longer pressing on your thoughts. In your mind, reach back and close an invisible door to the underworld, feeling it move on silent hinges, sealing the stone, the slope, the king, and the long, strange dignity of his endless work in calm and order. Then see a single candle, its flame steady in the darkness. With a slow, gentle breath, blow that candle out and let the last curl of light fade into the night. Rest well, sleep deeply, and let the ancient stories carry you into the night.